Dear friends and colleagues, on behalf of the Foundation for Research and Technology, I would like to thank you deeply for being with us today in this special event to honor the memory of our dear friend, Theodore Papazoglou. 1 year after his passing, Theo's absence is painful and he is sorely missed. Today, we are honored to have with us distinguished guests who knew and worked closely with Theo to talk about him and his life. I had the good fortune of first meeting Theo almost 20 years ago when I started working at Forth. Our initial scientific collaboration developed into a friendship that grew stronger over the years that followed. Theo graduated with honors from the University of Crete, the Department of Physics, in 1985. He then completed his PhD in biomedical engineering at the University of Southern California in 1989. After a short period of postdoctoral training at the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center of Los Angeles, Theo came back to Crete as a researcher at the Institute of Electronic Structure and Laser of Forth. He was the first to introduce biophotonics at Forth and had significant influence on the development of this field in Greece. I'm sure Professor Kostas Fotakis, former Minister for Research and Innovation, will have more to say about Theo's work in those years. Eventually, of course, Forth and Greece lost him to Brussels, where he initially served at the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship Program of the European Commission, and then as Assistant to the Director General for Research and Innovation. During that time, he became involved in the preparatory work for the creation of the European Research Council, the ERC. Professor Achilleas Mitsos, who was Director General for Research back then, will have more to say about those years. In those early years of the ERC, Theo would assist Fotis Kafatos, an ERC pioneer and the first president of its scientific council. Incidentally, Fotis was also one of Forth's founding fathers. Theo then served in the ERC executive agency and became head of Unit A1 that supports the ERC Scientific Council. Professor Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, president of the Scientific Council, as well as Dr. Waldemar Kut, director of the agency, and Dr. José Bastida, who succeeded Theo as head of the A1 unit, will talk about Theo's role at the ERC. I was also very fortunate to work with Theo again about 10 years after our scientific collaboration at Forth, when I became member of the ERC Scientific Council. He was always there to help and provide guidance with his deep knowledge and intimate understanding of EU functions, as well as ERC's history, its DNA. Once again, I came to appreciate his full dedication to the mission of empowering scientists to pursue frontier research. At the ERC, he was truly at home, and he worked relentlessly to contribute to its cause. With his experience at ERC, Theo played a pivotal role in the establishment a few years back of a Greek national funding agency, the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation, that is modeled after the ERC. To honor him, the HFRI, together with the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, created a new funding scheme in his name that was launched just last year. The program aims to support Greek researchers who have been evaluated favorably by the ERC, but were not eventually funded due to budget limitations. These are the so-called unfunded A proposals. Forth will also fund an exceptional interdisciplinary project in his memory via our intramural Forth Synergy Funding Initiative starting this year. In addition to this, we are planning to organize a biannual scientific symposium on biophotonics and bioimaging in his memory. What a better way to honor Theo than through science. Today, for the scientific part, we have the pleasure and the privilege to host 5 exceptional scientists who were also close collaborators of Theo to talk about the science that he loved so much. Dr. Janine Zakarakis from the Institute of Electronic Structure and Laser of Forth, Professor Jorge Ripoll from the University Carlos III of Madrid, Professors Katarina and Janine Swamberg from Lund University, and Professor Vasilis Diachristos from the Technical University of Munich. I would like to thank them all for their participation, and I would also like to thank everyone who helped with the organization of today's event, both here at Forth and at the ERC Executive Agency. Last but not least, I want to thank Janine Zakarakis for his efforts in putting together the program of today's event. I will now hand it over to Yanis, who will chair and coordinate the next sessions. So Yanni, please.
Thank you, Nectaria. It's also an honor for me to moderate this workshop in order to appropriately honor and tribute Theodore's memory. So I'd like, with no further ado, to welcome Professor Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, the President of the European Research Council, a colleague and friend of Theodore, to give his address. Professor Bourguignon.
You're muted.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Dear Elke Hennig, dear Minister Fotakis, dear Professor Mitsos, dear Valdemar, distinguished guests, dear colleagues and friends, I have to start my testimony with a special duty. Indeed, informed about the event, Commissioner Maria Gabriel entrusted me with the task to present her greetings to you. Here they are. I'm quoting her. The Elke Hennig Papazoglou, the Jonas, the Eliana, distinguished guest. I give a high value to the possibility to address you at the beginning of this very special event to honor the memory of a scientist who was a great supporter of Europe through his engaged work for the European Commission. He was one of the key people who, as head of the unit supporting the ERC Scientific Council in the ERC Executive Agency, was in a position to protect and keep alive the vision and the values of the European Research Council introduced by its founders, in particular the late Professor Fotis Kafatos, whose memory I want to pay tribute to here too. I didn't have the chance to meet Theodore Papazoglou so often, but I have a vivid memory of the meeting I had in September 2019 while preparing my hearing in front of the European Parliament as Commissioner Designate with President Bourguignon, Theodore Papazoglou, and a few other staff members. It was an unusual meeting because of the passion that they passed on to me in this quite critical moment of my journey to being confirmed as Commissioner. Great achievements need passion to live up to the expectations of the people who promote them. Theodore Papazoglou certainly was transmitting this passion when you met him. I know how much the ERC owes to him, and we therefore owe to him, as the ERC is a proof of the great things that the European Union can achieve when it acts boldly. He was a discreet but efficient pillar of the organization. His family and colleagues, of course, still feel strongly the void he has left. Yet, we all benefit from the great example he has set in being uncompromising with great wisdom when it comes to defending legitimate ambitions at European level. My most sincere thanks to Nectarios Stavranakis and the Greek colleagues who have set up the memorial. The memory of great people must be kept alive and will be. Maria Gabriel, end of quote. Let me now turn to my own tribute to someone with whom I worked so closely for more than 6 years and from whom I learned and benefited so much. I hope you will excuse me if I become emotional at some point during my speech, as talking about Theo's legacy brings so many very personal moments to my mind that I probably can't help being confronted with the void his death created. It is clear to many how much we miss his wisdom, nurtured by the depth of his understanding of the special institution the ERC is. This will be the leitfaden of my speech. As I knew that Theo's involvement with the ERC started prior to his coming to the ERC-EA, I reached out to some people who knew him in this context. Here is what Annie Andrikopoulou, a longtime commission official who worked closely with him, told me. Theodore joined the ERC before it was officially born, as a member of a small commission team tasked to set it up. I'm sure Professor Mitsos will comment on this further. And he said then, quote, Theodore was at his element. He shared the ERC fundamental principle of scientific excellence. He was aware of the needs and aspirations of the scientific community, having been a researcher himself, and he would never shy away from any challenge. Even when the team grew bigger and everybody specialized, he would gladly get out of his comfort zone to give his thoughts, arguments, and counter-arguments on any issue. This was, I think, one of his most appreciated qualities. He was able to see with the eyes of other people. How will the European Parliament react? What will our lawyers say? Can the scientists wait that long? Foresee potential problems and try to find the best solution. The ERC was a novelty in the scene at the European research landscape. Theodore has been capable to explore and exploit every leeway to make the ERC what it has become, an indispensable component of the future of European research. End of quote. Concerning the moment Theo joined the ERC, I asked Jacques Mété, ERC interim director for quite some time, who told me, quote, what struck me when I hired him at the ERCEA was his profound motivation and his determination to engage himself in this mission. The inspiration provided by the presence of Fotis Kafatos could have played a role in attracting Theo to the ERCEA, but he was always able to distinguish between the brilliant vision of leaders and the more deeply rooted aspirations of the scientific community. There was a special instance, end of quote. There was a special instance where I could have a direct insight into another dimension of Theo's personality. It was a visit to Forth to get to know better the environment in which Nectarios, then new member of the ERC Scientific Council, was working. Theo was so proud to show the place where he did a key part of his research, and so thrilled to meet one more time people he had worked with and had a high opinion of, such as Minister Fotakis. Actually, it was a random coincidence that on the day of my visit, there was a much more important visit to the Institute, namely that of Prime Minister Tsipras. What was supposed to be a 1-minute exchange with him grew into a 20-minute debate involving, of course, Minister Fotakis on how to define an appropriate research policy. A very special moment, and Theo's smiling face during the event is still in my mind. Actually, in addition to the travels outside Brussels on the occasion of plenary meetings of the ERC Scientific Council, I did few trips abroad with him. I want to recall one to Japan, because Theo was the key person to bring the discussions with Japanese agencies for setting up cooperation with the ERC to fruition. One day in Tokyo, we skipped lunch to visit a museum in Roppongi, and I remember the passionate discussion the two of us had on the importance of art in life. Theo's contribution to the running of the ERC has two sides, a very institutional one and a personal one through exchanges with the members of the Scientific Council. The first one happened through his formal contribution to the ERC Scientific Council as head of the unit in charge of supporting it, leading and motivating an amazing team of people. All council members remember his concise and accurate accounts of the action points during plenary meetings, but also on many occasions during board meetings, he would call the attention of participants to the fact that the discussion we're having was missing some key points that have been embodied in the legal text for a number of years, often after long fights to keep the ERC's autonomy. For that, he would always carry with him the big book of all the relevant texts and know exactly where to search to quote the key statement. He knew that letting anybody put the foot in the door could jeopardize the extraordinary adventure the ERC has been and still is. Our personal exchanges happened daily during my term as president. Even before I took office, I was still in the waiting room. Here is what he wrote to me on the 5th of November, 2013. So I'm quoting Theo, I also look forward to working with you, and I cannot hide that there will be quite a lot of ground to cover once we are in Brussels next year. However, this is in fact the interesting part about the DRC, namely its continuous transformation on the basis of the people who are involved in its evolution. I've witnessed this from the very early stages, and I can assure you that it is a rather challenging exercise, not always intellectually, I'm afraid. One important element that you may bring is your, and between quotation marks, clear pair of eyes, end of quotation mark, meaning not being involved and affected by the interactions, frictions, compromises with the central services of the European Commission. I think that this may help to renew the notion that I personally like about DRC, with the latter also being a laboratory for trying out new things. End of my quote of Theo. Jumping over 6 years of continuous invaluable exchanges, here's an excerpt from the last message I got from him, dated 9th of March 2020, in relation to the finalization of the 2019 ERC annual report I was in charge of, where some sentences I wrote were challenged by my successor. I'm quoting Theo. I thought that since people ask me also for my views, it would be also fair to be transparent towards you, simply because I worked and served under your presidency for the last 6 years and always tried to be open and honest, even when my views were not necessarily in line with the Commission, the Scientific Council, or the agency, or even you. I suppose I always considered this as a sign of health in the overall environment of increasing harmonization, end of quote. He then made some concrete suggestions for a constructive reformulation of what I had written. And I'm quoting Theo again, in a parallel channel, as he called it. I adopted a good part of them. I hope these quotes from Theo gives you a hint of why some people I mentioned earlier described him as, I'm quoting, the ideal civil servant on whom scientists, parliamentarians, and managers could rely, end of quote. Or another quote, a discreet person with very attentive to both strategic and personal issues, end of quote. Many of us, when confronted with the dilemma or lack of a clear prospect, asks themselves, what would Theo's advice be in such a situation? As a final note, I would like to offer a personal example of his attention to people. When I left the ERC in December 2019, Theo gave me a very special present, one of its kind. In our daily exchanges, we did from time to time discuss some of the very special, strange habits of mathematicians, my community. One of them is our insistence of using blackboards and chalk. After talking to his son, he told me, he came up with the idea of offering me as a souvenir a box of dustless chalks. They were coming from South Korea, although the idea of concern about dust is coming from nearby Japan. These are the chalks I'm now using in my office at the Institut des Hautes Études Scientifiques, when I can access it. Actually, in the very last message I received from Theo on 21st March 2020, copied from 1 cent to his team, he said, use now the weekend to spend time with your loved ones. This is a new era, and it is important to keep the human bond intact, especially those who are alone in Brussels and you have parents away. Take time and talk to them. They need to hear your voice, and I'm sure you too. As for me, what can I say? I'm fighting it. I'm living a new experience which looks and feels like a roller coaster. No point of sharing more, but perhaps when we meet again. Theo, we miss your voice and your smile. We miss you.
Thank you, Professor Bourguignon, for this address and your kind words towards Theodore. I'd like now to welcome Professor Fotakis for his address. Professor Fotakis, a distinguished member of FORTH, former director of ISL, former president of FORTH, also former alternate minister for research and innovation in Greece. Professor Fotakis. Please unmute.
Thank you, Yanni. When I think of Theo, and I think of him often, I recall one of the SMS messages he had sent me from Brussels in a period which had been very difficult for the ERC. He wrote, "Fighting greetings from Brussels. This is a period full of challenges, but also a period of conviction that what we are pursuing is good and visionary." This was typical of Theodoris. This was Theo. He was a source of calm strength and inspiration. I first met with Theo in the early 80s when he was a student of physics at the department in the University of Crete. He was one of my first students. I remember his undergraduate diploma work. The topic was design and development of a nitrogen laser. Considering the limited resources available at the time, it was a manifestation of his abilities in experimental physics, his solid scientific background, and his inventive way of thinking. We soon became friends, discussing science, but also sharing views on the role of science in society. He was always sensitive on social issues and concerned about social inequalities. His outlook on these matters, although global, always had references to the history and situation in Greece. Later, whenever I was visiting Brussels, one of my first tasks was to meet with Theo for a full analysis, for a full discussion of the current developments. But besides being a good friend, Theo was also a valued collaborator. He was one of the driving forces in expanding the Institute of Electronic Structure and Laser at FORTH, where, as a researcher, he established the field of biophotonics. He was not only a source of ideas and expertise, but most important, he inspired the spirit of determination for pursuing scholarship, scientific quality, and excellence. I should mention that several of his students of that time are nowadays established researchers in different parts of the world. In addition, Theo played a key role in the early 90s for the recognition of the Institute's laser laboratories as a European laser facility. This opened new challenging avenues and brought us in contact with distinguished scientists in this field, including Janine and Katarina Swamberg and the Lund Laser Center, who are present with us today. His placement in Brussels in 2003, working closely with Achilleas Mitsos, Director General for Research, opened up new prospects for Theo in understanding and making science policy. A milestone in this new career, as you heard, was his involvement in setting up the ERC as a collaborator of Fotis Kafatos. Given this, it is not a coincidence that Theo was regarded as the historic memory of ERC. I should also point out that later, several of the ERC's good practices were promoted by Theo to be adopted by the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation, the ELIVEC, which was established in 2016, having ERC as a prototype. All the above are only pieces of Theo's contributions to science, science policy, and society. This was Theo for me, a friend, a colleague, a person with generosity of spirit and the ability to inspire the many. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fotakis, for your kind words. I'd like now to welcome Professor Mitsos, former Director General for Research at the European Commission, and the person who convinced Theodore to change gears and move to Brussels. Professor Mitsos.
Yes. Well, Theodoris was my friend also, a very good friend from the moment he arrived in Brussels. Actually, I met him before, but we became friends from the moment he arrived in Brussels. And we became very close during these last years of my term as Director General. But why did we become so close? Well, simply because we shared a passion. His main task and my main task was to overcome all the difficulties that existed in order to establish ERC. You may think that the establishment of ERC started with the creation of ERC, but in reality, we had a lot of foes and we had to turn them into friends. And his contribution, Theodoris' contribution to that was enormous. Let me simply briefly say that member states, the European Community Union member states and the Commission services were almost reluctant. Well, of course, let me start, I start by saying that the academic community was always pushing for some sort of institution that will have research, basic research or fundamental research or excellence as the sole criteria. But member states and the Commission services could not easily accept that. In reality, we had to change the rationale for EU intervention. Up to that moment, EU intervention was based on the fact that some teams should collaborate, some international teams should collaborate. And now we had to establish that, no, we don't need this international collaboration as the European value-added definition, but we have to simply accept that a European-wide competition based on excellent research is by itself the sole and unique rationale for establishing a certain institution. We did not need the perception of useful research, but we wanted to go beyond that. Now, I must say that this type of difficulties we had with member states, we couldn't overcome without Theodoris really every day attempts to meet people, to convince people at all levels and try to establish this new way of seeing things. But this was not enough because in reality, even the academic community mistrusted the Commission. The Commission should establish an institution that would be at arm's length from the Commission. This autonomy of ERC was something that no one really thought that the Commission could do. And so we had to convince the academic community, our friends, we had to convince them that what we are going to establish is really their institution, that the Commission would do everything needed in order to let them do the job. Again, this was a main task and we had to deliver it mainly by the selection of people. We decided that we are not going to select the board. No, we had to establish a select committee in order to establish the board. And this was something extremely important, again, because we had to overcome the mistrust. It's very difficult to talk about Theodore's contribution because at that time, Theodore's contribution was almost silent, but very present, very real, very not just important, but indispensable. We wouldn't have done it without Theodore's. I'm putting that in those simple terms, and I mean it. We couldn't have done it without Theodore's at that time. So I personally think that it's not just the scientific community that should know that and remember that, but I personally have never forgotten that, and I will never forget it. I cherish Theodore's memory, not just as a very good friend, but also as somebody whom you could trust that his everyday acts would be towards achieving this extremely important task and passion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mitsos. I'd like now to welcome Dr. Waldemar Kütt, the Director of the European Research Council Executive Agency, the agency where Theodore was working. Professor Kütt.
Thanks, Giannis. Dear family, friends, colleagues of Theo, you've heard already some great tributes to Theo as the current director of the ERC Executive Agency. I want to briefly speak about the qualities which made him such a valued and very important member of the team in the agency. As what Mr. Mitsos said, of course, Theo, he would always be the first to tell you that he worked for the European Research Council and not only for an agency of the Commission. I mean, that was his vision. And it was very important to him because he lived through that creation and birth of the ERC. He understood the vision for a new type of autonomous research funder governed by an independent scientific council and with its own staff. That was his vision, and he would always remind his team, the management of the agency, and even the scientific council when he saw it in danger. And it was important to him because, as we heard, he had been himself an accomplished scientist, both in Greece and the United States. But he did not take a naive view of science as a heroic enterprise governed only by higher motives and rationality. Being who he was, he had a very clear-eyed view of the day-to-day practice of science. He knew that scientists had to sell their work, to publish, to get funding, to make a career, and to support their families. But he also knew that scientists could not be commanded to solve climate change one day. And he also knew that excellent professors and scientists did not always make good entrepreneurs that would build and create billion-dollar companies. This experience understanding meant he could always offer some wise advice about new schemes or proposals of the Scientific Council or the Commission. But this was just part of what Theo brought to the agency. As we know, Theo worked for many years in the European Commission prior to joining the agency. He understood the role of a Director General and of the Cabinet. I actually worked with Theo the first time when he was assistant to Mr. Mitsos, and I was working in the Cabinet of the Research Commissioner. Theo knew his way around the inter-service consultation and the ordinary legislative procedures, all words that sounds unfamiliar to you, but it's the language of the Commission that you need to understand to work within it. He also knew what went on in the Parliament, the Justice Lipsis building, and the European Parliament. He understood how the system worked and what levers to pull, when to escalate an issue and when to diffuse it. And I think this was hugely useful to the Scientific Council and the agency. But a part of his knowledge of the Commission's workings and his background as scientist, what made Theo truly stand out were his qualities as a human being. Theo was always a calm and measured and a good-humored person. He would not panic in crisis. He was reassuring to have around. He was actually fun to have around. He was not afraid to speak out in meetings, but he always knew when to have a quiet word in someone's ears. And he didn't like to play interinstitutional politics. but he could get his way if necessary. He didn't play favorites, but he looked after his staff, and they in turn were fiercely loyal to him. And so in the end, it was Theo's character that made him invaluable. The scientific council did not listen to him because of his knowledge. Some people might have used this knowledge to bamboozle them. The scientific council listened to him because they trusted him. If Theo said it couldn't be done, then it probably couldn't be done. And if Theo said it could be done, then it probably could. Theo's loss left a gap which we will never be able to fully close. The agency will always remember him, and we will always miss him. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kitt, for your kind words. I'd like now to welcome Dr. Josela Bastida, Head of Unit A1 of the European Research Council, and the person who took over responsibilities from Theodore. Dr. Bastida.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. And let me start my words by thanking the organizers of this event for this initiative and for inviting me to share some reflections to honor the memory of Theo. Theo was a very special person to many of us. He was a firm defender of the idea that the groundbreaking results in research emerge when researchers are unrestricted in their thoughts. And he worked constantly during his years at the ERC to build this environment possible for this to happen. This space where researchers think freely about the next question is now a reality that is paying off. Theo was able to see how the ERC is changing the research landscape in Europe, but he left us too early to perceive the long-term impact that the research funded by ERC will have. But many of us will see it, and we will remember his vision, his commitment as being part of a project that marked a before and an after for research in Europe. I met Theo when I joined the ERC Executive Agency in February 2011. With my incorporation, the management of the agency was completed, being Theo and I the only ones who were not commission officials. This certainly brought us together from day one, but we soon realized that we have much more in common. We both had a scientific career before jumping into science management and research policy. In addition, our scientific careers had common features. We both did our PhD in the United States, and after a few years of postdoctoral work, we returned to our countries of origin as tenure researchers. Curiously, we both interrupted our research careers in the same year, in 2001. Theo then began to work at the European Commission as a seconded national expert, and I began my new career at the Ministry of Science and Technology of Spain as Deputy Director General for Research. We soon discovered that we also had a common vision of what Europe needed to make a significant qualitative leap in research. We had worked on it during the years prior to our incorporation to the ERC, Theo in various positions at the Year Research and Innovation, where he was instrumental, and we have, some of you have highlighted this morning, and I, of course, from a much modest side in my journey through different positions of responsibility linked to the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation. We both shared the feeling that we were among the lucky ones that from the executive agency of the ERC had been chosen to contribute to materializing the project for which we have long dreamed of. We spent almost 10 years working together. Theo side by side with the Scientific Council and with the colleagues in his unit, and I consolidating the scientific management processes designed by the Scientific Council and supervising a large department. We had years of constant interaction, of constant exchange of ideas, of improvement after improvement, and above all, of feeling how our efforts were paying off. The different indicators did not stop raising, and after 10 years of its creation, the ERC began to see itself as the funding organization that was producing the research with the most significant scientific impact worldwide. A collective effort, no doubt, but the satisfaction was hard to hide. Of course, Theo was always more skeptical than I was when looking at these achievements. It was intrinsic to his character. During all these years, I learned a lot from him. His knowledge of the history of the ERC and his legal setting was extraordinary. This value will be difficult to recover. I always appreciated the way Theo addressed many of the common matters that affected the units under our supervision. I will never stop admiring how he approached the different issues, often solving them with a simple smile. After 10 years as head of the scientific department, I became head of the support to the scientific council unit, the position that Theo had during all this time. It is for me a great honor to have the responsibility. During these months in the unit, I have observed how proud his members were of him, how much they admire, they love him. Theo has set the bar very high. And this represents a major challenge for me that I accept with the highest respect. Personally, I consider it a privilege that fate has bestowed this responsibility on me, and I will do everything in my hands to ensure that Theo will have been proud of his unit's performance. Fortunately, I am not alone on this. I feel also privileged for working with a great team in the unit, and I know that I can count on them to achieve this goal. Theo will be always missed, but his legacy will guide us in this endeavor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Bastida, and thanks to all the panelists who shared their vivid memories and kind words for Theodore. I'd like now to close this first session of the workshop and invite you to reconvene at 11:50 with the second part, the scientific program. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you very much for being back. We will now begin the scientific session. And it's a pleasure to introduce a long-time collaborator and friend, Dr. Janine Zakarakis, who is principal researcher at the Institute of Electronic Structure and Laser of Forth. I came to know Yanis through Theo about 20 years ago, and we have been close collaborators ever since. At the time, Theo and Yanis, together with the biophotonics team of the Institute, were developing multiphoton microscopy methodologies that were then applied to study cell physiology and neurodegeneration. This initial collaboration developed into one of the most productive cross-discipline activities, bridging Forth's institutes. In a sense, Theo's legacy lives through such unifying efforts, and Yanis is going to kickstart the scientific session of today's event by talking about the current state of biophotonics research at Forth and future perspectives. So, Yanni, please.
Thank you, Nectaria, for the kind introduction. So let me share my screen first. So it's, as I said before, it's really an honor to be presenting here and participate in this workshop to honor Theodore, who was my PhD advisor and really a mentor to my scientific and research career. So the title of my talk is Biophotonics at Forth, Laser-Based Methods in Biomedicine and Beyond. And I will spend most of the time of this presentation in going back in time and presenting what we were doing at that time with Theodore, when Theodore was head of the group. Some of the pioneering work, and of course, bridge it to what is going on now in biophotonics at Forth. Also knowing that Professor Ripple, the next speaker, will talk for quite, covering quite some years after Theodore left and bridge it to now. I'd like to start with a slide that I showed last year, almost 1 year ago, when I was invited. I was asked to give a seminar, the first virtual seminar of ISL after the first wave of the pandemic kind of relaxed and things moved to more normal. Of course, having the loss of Theodore so recent, it was just straightforward for me to dedicate the seminar to Theodore, who was really a colleague, a mentor, and friend, and propose at that time some initiatives that Forth and the Institute could take to honor his memory. I'm really glad that even in this format, the virtual format, we organized this this workshop. And as Professor Zakarakis said, both Forth and the Institute are committed to organize a real symposium for him, and also establish scholarships and funding to his name within Forth. So I'm really glad that this commitment is there. Now let's do a fast rewind to the 2000s, and about the time that he was considering to move to Brussels. And at that time, the biophysical and biomedical group under his leadership. So the principal researcher was Theodore, and there were 3 postdocs, Dr. Philippidis, myself, and Professor Ripple, who has just joined Forth at that time. Graduate students, Dr. Vasilakis, who is now a researcher, a newly elected researcher at ISL after spending some time in a renowned university at Princeton in USA. And Mikhail Sofanakis, who is now a distinguished teacher in high school teacher, and a lot of undergraduate students. Projects that and research topics that the group was involved with, both in under the framework of European funding, but also driven out of pure scientific curiosity. So where the laser-based fluorescent, laser-induced fluorescent-based detection of malignancies, optical characterization of biopsy samples, the European thematic network, the optical methods for medical diagnosis and monitoring of diseases, MEDFOD. So these two, the optimum and the MEDFOD, were, let's say, involving all stakeholders around Europe in bringing biooptics and biophotonics into the clinic and into biology. And then the projects that were driven by scientific curiosity, so optical tweezing and manipulation of microparticles, photodynamic therapy of leukemic cells. Of course, you cannot do bioptics without attending theory of light propagation in turbid media, and random lasing, which was a very hot topic at that time. Moving a little bit further back in time, in the 1997, and I'd like to show you some of the results of this project, involving laser-induced fluorescence from biological samples, and actually presenting you a very simple mobile prototype system built to be able to get fluorescence signals from biological samples, but from realistic settings for within the clinic. So this was a schematic of the setup and the spectra that we were detecting at that time with Dr. Philippidis in charge of this. from samples that were brought from operations performed at the university hospital, and basically trying to differentiate and classify different types of tissue, differentiate normal from pathologic tissue, as in this case with peripheral vascular tissue from bypass operations, or differentiating different compartments of the human heart. Now, why this was very important? It was important because within these European projects, it gave us the opportunity to participate in one of the first multi-center clinical studies performed in collaboration with other research centers in Europe and performed at the Royal London Hospital in UK. So people from Forth, from Lund University and the Free University of Amsterdam did a field trip actually with their equipment. This is the small apparatus that we have built at that time. But the other groups had systems that can perform in the same identical conditions within the operation room, but using different methods, and try to compare. So you can see here Dr. Philippidis, myself, and Professor Swamberg with her team from Lund, but also the Dutch team and the doctor, the local doctor. So this was really pioneering and inspiring in going into real clinical settings and perform real-time measurements. One other aspect that I think was quite pioneering in the search for ways to classify and differentiate different types of tissue, in collaboration with the Technical University of Crete, we applied neural networks. At that time was 99, 2000. Neural networks to classify and differentiate normal from pathologic tissue. At the same time, these years, the ultraviolet laser facility of ISL installs a state-of-the-art instrument that can, this so-called streak camera, that can detect and image in very high resolution, ultra-fast resolution, light propagating through complex systems, just like biological tissue. It gave us the opportunity to detect with a temporal resolution of 2 picoseconds when used with the ultra-fast laser systems that were also installed in the facility with laser pulses of 200 femtoseconds. You can see here this instrument, the streak camera, together with the ultra-fast laser, femtosecond laser system in the lab. Coupled with a spectrograph, we could also detect with a spectral resolution of 1 nanometer and have both temporal and spectral analysis of the systems, of the phenomenon. Now, the first application that we did, and this was just straightforward, being here and having the university hospital next to us, was to try to play with the alteration of these ultra-short pulses as they propagate through highly scattering media, just as tissue. So you can see here an image of this laser pulse in time. So time goes to this direction. So a very short laser pulse, as it propagates through tissue, then it becomes very broad. By fitting with appropriate mathematical formulas, then you can try to see if these different optical properties experienced with different tissue can give us differentiation. In this study, 35 patients were involved, and indeed we could differentiate tissues, different types of tissue, normal from pathologic, based on these simple properties, a simple approach. Moving a little bit forward, 2 years, and then really this was a project driven by pure scientific curiosity. It was a project involving the study of random lasers, which was a very hot topic at that time, and very, let's say, strange and peculiar phenomenon. So in a typical regular laser cavity, you have the amplifying material, the medium, that you excite with some way, and then it emits photons, and as the photons propagate and bounce back and forth between two mirrors, they cause a stimulated emission that then results in laser radiation and results in the specific characteristics that laser radiation has, specifically and more pronouncedly coherence. Now, in a random laser, what you have is a highly diffusing and scattering medium that also has the property to emit photons when it's excited. But then the peculiar phenomenon is that due to this increased scattering, the increased scattering causes an increase in path length of the photons inside this medium. So you can see here as it scatters, as photons scatter, the path length increases, and this gives the amplification. If you see the emission and you play with the energy, the excitation energy that you put there, you can see it changing from a typical spectral emission, wide spectral emission. You can see these very sharp and intense spikes, and these are the lasing modes within this scattering medium. The images here, the two images, are what we were detecting with the STRI camera and the ultra-fast laser systems. So this is the typical thing. Again, time is down and wavelength is going to the right. And you see by this broad emission, both in time and spectrum. When you go after above certain threshold conditions, then you get this very sharp emission, this both in time and spectral. You get this very, as I said, spiky emission. So we were able to do this and prove this both with one photon excitation and two photon excitation using these special lasers, and also play with the energies and plot the lifetime, the duration of this emitted random lasing modes as a function of the pump intensity, the pump energy, and show this very characteristic behavior of lasers when you go above a certain threshold in energy. This sharp narrowing happens. Now, of course, this was very nice, but the true question to answer, if you want to say and imply that this is laser radiation, you have to see if it is coherent. And we were the first to apply a specific method, photostatistics, using that camera again, to study the coherent properties of this emission. And both in applying the method, the photostatistics and mathematical models to fit the coherent and non-coherent light emitted from these systems, we were able to prove that both with one photon and two photon excitation, we had coherent emission from this highly diffusive and highly scattering media, which is, counterintuitive if you think of it of just pure laser, let's say, physics. And this study actually led to what I think was a seminal paper published in Optics Letters, and we were at that time we were competing with some of the really world leaders in the field. And we were the first to actually manage to publish this. The main competitor, Professor Kao at Yale University, managed to do exactly the same and publish 1 year later in 2001 exactly the same results and proving that we were correct. This study, this research project gave us the opportunity to participate in this Gordon conference at Connecticut College at 2000. Here we are, Theodore, myself, Professor Swamberg also was participating. Professor Diachristos also made a day visit there. But also, I've put some names here to show you how important this work was. because some of the people participating there were the leading the pioneers of the field of biooptics and biophotonics, and still some of them are really the pioneers. Now, fast forward to 2021, and I'm sure Jorge will cover the period in between. His legacy continues with the biophotonics activities at ISL 4th and 4th in general. At ISL 4th, two labs with the two students, Dr. Philippidis and myself. So non-linear microscopy lab and the biophotonics led by Dr. Philippidis, and the biophotonics and molecular imaging lab that I have the pleasure to lead. Now, both these activities are focused on developing systems and methods to look into biological processes and diseases within living matter, within model organisms or tissues. With a non-linear microscopy lab, just a brief overview of some of the things that they are working on there. So again, using nonlinear microscopy techniques to look into biology or disease. So one example, use these nonlinear techniques to identify different stages of T cells. These are the cells of our immune system, and different stages of the activation of these T cells, basically different stages of an infection. Or using nonlinear microscopy techniques as a diagnostic tool for cancer research, in this case, specifically for breast cancer, and using these specific techniques, the third harmonic generation and second harmonic generation, as a tool to provide a more quantitative measure and image of cancerous tissue in the search to give a more objective, let's say, way to identify cancer on top of classical pathology, so providing digital pathology in a sense. Also monitoring biological processes in living in model organisms, like lipid deposition in C. elegans, which is highly related to aging. In my laboratory, what we are focused on is to develop the tools to image across the scales, from microscopy to mesoscopy and to macroscopy, with optical, mostly optical techniques, but also other hybrid techniques. So in this case, in microscopy and mesoscopy, imaging protein dynamics in C. elegans, in model organisms. Also chemotherapy studies within these engineered living materials, or spheroids or organoids that are commonly named now. Tomographic imaging with in vivo studies in small animals, a field that also Professor Ripple has played a lot of a big role in establishing here. Also hybrid methods, as I said, combining optoacoustics and optical microscopy in trying to study ocular pathologies and anatomy, also plant biology. Applied also in cultural heritage, a lot of applications. The group being physicists, engineers, and mathematicians, we also try to develop new techniques to try to break the depth to resolution limit of optical imaging within tissue by applying adaptive wavefront shaping methods. I'd like to finish with one other project that I think Theodore would have been proud of, because it kind of follows his approach that research needs to have a social impact. And with this project, we try to create take, let's say, actual and active research projects and convert them into learning material that students, high school students, can learn from. So this was a project led by Michalis Orphanakis, the former master student of Theodore, who actually built first an optical computed tomography based on Lego and Arduino, and later an optical tweezer based on a high school microscope. And this was actually his master thesis on optical tweezing. So these two experiments and projects won several prizes both at national and European level within the Science on Stage competition, and we are actually very proud of. And I'd like to finish now with by thanking Theodore for my first steps in science, and also by sharing this photo. I think this was one of the first digital photos taken in the institute, with a digital camera that, if I remember correctly, was a present from Elke, his wife, and he was actually very proud when he brought it to the institute. That was really very early times, and it was a very strange gadget to have around. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, Yanni, I think you should continue introducing the next speakers.
Yeah, I will stop sharing, and I'd like to introduce now Professor Ripple, a longtime friend and colleague. Jorge got his bachelor in physics and PhD also in physical science from the Autonomous University in Madrid. He did postdoctoral stays at UPenn in US, in Ford, in UCL, and Harvard, and then he was appointed researcher at Ford, both at the assistant level and principal level, before joining, again, moving away and going back to Spain and joining the University Carlos III in Madrid as an associate professor. So without further ado, Jorge, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I think you need to allow me to share my PowerPoint. In the meantime, I'd like to start by just saying that I was very humbled to have been thought of to be included in this memorial for Theodore. And it also gives me the chance of thanking Theodore and Forth for some very amazing years that I had the chance to experience in Crete. And with that, I hope you can see my presentation. So my idea, what I wanted to show is like a short, really short history. So I hope nobody gets offended because I'm skipping many things that happen, but especially a short history that has to do with especially the involvement of Forth, especially through Theodore, as one of the major forces in the early beginnings of bioptics. So in order to like center ourselves, I like to first start a little bit on the basis of scattering, because this talk is based on optical properties and on how the community changed from really wanting to measure optical properties in order to associate those with some pathology or some disease, and how we went from trying to measure, recover those, to imaging, and now things that are happening. And I will just finish by showing some examples of what we're doing in my lab. Okay, so first we need to understand we're using light. So any light propagation is governed by by absorption, by the presence of absorption, that what it do, it would make the intensity decrease, and scattering. And scattering, what it does, it changes the direction of the beam. So for that, I always show these slides are really old, you know that, Yanis, and but I think they're very indicative. What you're going to see here is just some photographs of a glass of water where I'm going to start adding some drops of yogurt, which is basically fat. So of course, if there are no drops of fat, you wouldn't see that laser beam if we're taking the image from the top. But as you put one drop, you see that light goes in a straight path, and that's what we call ballistic propagation. That means that it doesn't really lose its original direction. An image could go through that, and you can still see that image. But you do see that there starts to be some loss due to scattering. So as there's more and more drops in there, that medium scatters more and more, and at the end, what we have is what we call a diffusive medium, where basically we lost all spatial information. So depending on which of the ranges you're at, if you have very, very low scattering, we can use ballistic propagation, and this means that any method that uses lenses, like for example, any microscopic approach, is based on ballistic propagation. And if we go to the other way, where we have diffuse propagation, because there's a lot of scattering, then we completely lose all that spatial information, right? So we have to use very, very different methods. There's one thing in the middle, and this is something that we have always been very interested in, both from the theoretical and for experimental point, which is those small samples that are not really in either of them. So you can't really use microscopy to image to them. What you're seeing here is a Drosophila pupa, and they're not scattering enough so that you need to use diffusion. And I will cover this a little bit later on. So going on to the history, I think we could, at least from my point, one of the major papers that came out, that was the late 80s, was this paper by Patterson, Britton, Chance, and Wilson, where they demonstrated that using time-resolved measurements from a laser pulse, they could infer some tissue optical properties. So this spurred, I think, a new area, which is trying to measure those optical properties and kind of see if those optical properties, as Yanis also showed before, also using a fluorescence lifetime, how those could be, you can associate those to disease progression or cancer or some kind of diagnosis. So what happened then, and this is where Thor is, and Forth was a major key player, is that there was a lot of measurements of the optical properties of tissue. Most of these were done ex vivo. What Yanis showed, most of it was in vivo actually. But when we really wanted to measure the scattering properties and optical properties, what usually happened, for example, in this paper I'm showing here, that was done under Theodore's supervision. What you see is that we measured this using this 3 camera that Yanis mentioned. We could measure the scattering properties of breast tissue that was excised. So this took place within the framework, and Yanis mentioned this before. These 2 very big projects, Optimum in FP5, and Medford, which was a network, and also during this time, there were many conferences happening. And I like to show this one because I really think this was an incredible conference, because we had the best people, internationally speaking, that were there present. So this organized this in 2002. Yeah, and I have here just very few photographs. So this was within the framework of Optimum. That was also we also took a chance and got together there and Medford, and you can see many very famous people that participated here. Basically anybody that was really somebody in Europe and in laser physics that went into biooptics was there, and it was a really exciting community, and many amazing things happening. This was at the Cretan dinner, which is one of the most amazing events I could remember. And you see, of course, here Professor Swamberg and Ronaldo Cubedo. So they're very famous people here, and it was a really nice community. I would say it was like a big family. So anyway, those were the years where we were basically trying to figure out the tissue optical properties. And at the same time, there was a movement. This was basically in the group of Arjun Yad and Britton Chan. So there is where Vasilis Zakarakis was doing his PhD, and we became friends during those years. And there, instead of trying to measure directly the optical properties, what they were doing there is they were measuring relative changes, and that turned to be a much more robust approach to imaging. So, and there they developed this technique, which was called the diffuse optical tomography. So you could obtain a 3D image of relative changes of basically absorption, which is what you see here. That later on evolved more. So when this was Vasilis, he moved to Harvard, and there this technique was, instead of trying to image directly changes in optical properties, we could use fluorescence as an indicator of molecular events. And this technique was termed fluorescent molecular tomography, and it managed then to put optics inside also all these other plethora of molecular imaging modalities. So this paper made a huge impact, and basically everybody that was working in the field trying to image using absorption as a source of contrast, we all kind of migrated to this new other field where we were using fluorescence. And that's what Yanis mentioned. We did a lot of work of this within this in fourth, especially we collaborated a lot with the group in with the IMBB, the biology, with Klioma Malaki, and many interesting things happened using fluorescence as a source. The next thing that happened, following history, is that we all knew in the field that we're missing anatomy here. So, and if you remember that first image for breast cancer was actually combining absorption with MRI. So there was a lot of effort also in trying to combine different modalities, for example, X-ray with FMT, and in this manner also improve the quality of the reconstructions in FMT. And as you see here, I kind of divided this because here is where things split, at least for all of us that were interested in working in areas where scattering was high but not too high. And you will see this soon. What happened after that is that optoacoustic was, of course, a very important thing before this. And I know Vasilis was involved in optoacoustics way before his most important papers. But I would say after 2015. It was clear that optoacoustic was going to be the main modality for imaging optical properties of tissue. And a lot of work has been going on there. And of course, I won't say anything because that's his talk is going to be on, I guess, centered also on optoacoustics. And I wanted to move on to the other side that I missed here, which is things that were happening in the other area, which with low scatterings, with small specimens. And there was it's not really a new technique. I would have to say that light sheet microscopy, there were a few papers published many years before this 2004 paper by Jan Huskin. But it was the first time it was shown that you could use light sheet microscopy to image in vivo. So this made a very big impact. And actually, light sheet microscopy is still going on, and there are many other developments happening within that community. And I'd have to mention that, for example, one of them is lattice light sheet microscopy that was developed by Betsy, which is one of the Nobel Prize winners a few years back. So within this framework, what I like to understand is that scattering is there, and we have to somehow deal with it. So I want to center myself in trying to solve these type of problems. What happens when you have samples, ideally they're live samples that you want to image, and there's a lot of scattering? How can we deal with this? So there's another tool that came out also near that 2004, which is optical projection tomography. This one didn't make such a big impact as light sheet microscopy, I think, mainly because it requires a reconstruction algorithm, which makes it a bit more cumbersome to apply. but it's nonetheless, it's a very interesting approach. It's basically the same as an X-ray image, but instead of using X-rays, we use light, so you can image fluorescence or absorption. So what I'm showing here, this is work that we were doing at Fourth, and what you're seeing is the process of the header version of Drosophila. You can see here the salivary glands, the fat bodies, and we managed to do this taking something like 500 OPT measurements, each one with 500 angles. So it really took a long time, and you can see that the image is okay. You can see things. You can see the wings. You can see the legs. But you see, especially when there's a lot of movement, that you have a complete loss of information. So this, during the same time, we also started developing our own light sheet microscopy setup. And for those of you that are not aware of how it works, the principle is really simple. If you generate a light sheet with your laser beam, so you shine your laser beam, generate a light sheet, and you just move your sample through it, you can with that reconstruct a 3D image. This of course works as long as your sample is transparent. And for that, there's been a lot of work and many very important publications that show how you can make tissue transparent. But of course, this doesn't work for in vivo, but it's very useful for ex vivo measurements for whole organs. And here's an example where we compare this. This was done there at Fourth, my time there with Alicia Ranz. And what you're seeing here is a technique which was basically OPT, but with a helical motion, so you can do high throughput. But what I want to more put you're interested in is that you're comparing here OPT, which you see is lower resolution than light sheet microscopy. So SPIM is one of the ways that we can generate a light sheet microscope image. So you can see that the images are different. You get different information from both, but I think they both offer very interesting possibilities. So the idea when you have a fixed plane light sheet microscope is what I mentioned before. Is rather simple. You have a single sheet, and then you put your sample around. But since we want the speed, we could go really fast at each of these planes. What you're seeing here is a zebrafish. What you're seeing is the blood pumping through the heart of a zebrafish. So we can go really quickly in a single plane. But the idea was, let's see if we can go really quickly in a whole volume, all right? And for that, we used some other papers that were published, especially by Farbach. And what you do here is, if you have your light sheet moving around and you have something which is called tunable lens, and that allows you to play with your focal plane, you can move them around, and this is kind of the hard part here. If you synchronize them, then you can generate a volume really quickly. This is what you see here. So this is an implementation that we did, and you can see the head. This is a zebrafish. You see the eyes here. This will be the cavity in the heart there. So you can see we can go really quickly. We can do something in the order of like 10 volumes per second. So this allows, instead of having a single slice there with very good temporal resolution, we can image a whole heart ideally before it has changed too much. Okay, and we can do this really quickly. This opens also other avenues, which I think are very interesting, which is we can do very large samples. This is the brain of a mouse that has been cleared. This is very important. This is not in vivo. The sample has been cleared so that we can image through it, and we can since it goes really fast, we can do very large volumes without compromising that sample. Other thing we can do, since we can do many measurements, we can also measure several angles and combine these. This is also ex vivo. This is a cleared heart. And we can combine these angles, which if you compare with only one measurement, it improves, significantly improves the quality. So this brings me then to the idea that I wanted to share with you, which is that we can combine both. So we can use the statistical information that we obtain with many angles together with SPIM. And I'll explain a little bit why this is important, okay? So what you see here is a Monte Carlo simulation, and I have here, so that you get an idea of how much scattering is present. We have, when there's really a little bit of scattering, this is ballistic propagation. And what you're seeing here is we have this helix here that simulates that has fluorescence. Ideally, they should be all the same, and you see they're not. So the closer you are from the camera, the greater the intensity. This actually intensity goes down, following Beer's law, as you would expect. And as scattering goes up, you see that the depth where you get information is less and less and less, okay? If you see this from the top, in both cases, this is what you're seeing here. The idea here, instead of taking each of the slices and obtaining an image, which is what you see here, this is the 3D image, our idea was, what if we use the statistics of each of these? So instead of keeping all the stack, we just keep one image for each angle. And that would be a statistical image, for example, the maximum intensity projection, or the sum of all those slices, or standard deviation, any statistic that you want to think of. So if you do this, imagine you have all your data here. You can generate a maximum intensity projection. This is what you're seeing is long data here with for a single angle, okay? We can obtain all these measurements. So the idea is, this is a real, just one single angle, okay, for long data. With all that data, we generate just one single projection. In this case, for example, the sum. And then we start rotating, and we do the same for other angles. And we obtain something which would look like an OPT, but an OPT would have much lower quality and much lower resolution. And once we combine all of this, we obtain a reconstruction, which is a mixture of the light sheet images and the optical projection tomography. And we call this the statistical projection optical tomography. And what happens is that this is much more robust in the presence of scattering, and you can still use this in vivo if you can go fast enough. That's just one of the main drivers of this technique, is that we can do like at least 10 volumes per second. And that's mainly what I wanted to show you today. And with that, as conclusion, I think, so it was a very long and very interesting journey that started, I think, in the late 80s and early 90s, where we tried to measure in vivo optical properties that has proven to be extremely challenging, and what is much more robust has been seen to be relative changes, which is basically what's being used in many, many different imaging modalities. And with respect to those organs or small samples that exhibit scattering, I think there's still new avenues that we can explore. And one of them, Janis didn't have much time to go over it, but are those cases when you can use different profiles of your beam with high coherence to try to kind of get around all that scattering that's present, to see if we can image in vivo, especially in those samples that are small but not small enough, and large but not large enough to use other techniques. And with that, I'd just like to finish again thanking all the people involved, especially again I'd like to thank Theodore. He was key for in my early career, and helped me take off, and Forth in general for being my house and my home for so many years, and especially Alicia Ranz, who also passed away last year, and many of the work that I presented here was also done with her. I would like, I don't know if there's any questions. If there are, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Jorge, for this fascinating presentation. It's always a pleasure to see you presenting and seeing the amazing things that you do. The speakers, I forgot to mention before, but all the speakers will take questions at the discussion and question session at the end of the presentations. So this will facilitate the progress of the program. So thank you, Jorge, again. Also, thank you on a personal level for some great years when you were here. I'd like now to welcome to the floor Professor Katarina Swamberg. Just to introduce Katarina, she's Chief Consultant in Oncology and Adjunct Professor of Oncology at Lund University, and Distinguished Professor of Biophotonics at South China Normal University in Guangzhou, China. Involved in research in biophotonics since actually the beginning, since 1982. together with her life and research partner, also husband, Professor Janine Swamberg, who will speak after her, with many awards to her name, also serving as president of the International Society of Optics and Photonics, the SPIE, and receiving its gold medal, as well as the NIH Pioneering Award for bringing biophotonics to the clinic. Professor Swamberg, the floor is yours. It's a pleasure to introduce you to this workshop.
Thank you so much, Yanis, and thank you for organizing this. When you first contacted me and us, I was so sad. Then you really invited us to a memorial workshop, and that's the least you can think for this lively, wonderful person, Theodore Papazoglou. So thank you for this opportunity. And as you said, I am by clinical training an oncologist, but I have also been involved in biophotonics since many years, as we heard, and I have this dual affiliation with Lund University and South China Normal University in Guangzhou, China. I will talk about some challenges in medicine, and of course there are many of them, and maybe some of them could have a possibility to have a solution with biophotonics, bio-optical techniques. And being an oncologist, I of course would like to start with cancer and telling you that there is an increasing incidence of cancer, and early detection, minimal invasive therapy, these are challenges for the oncology field. We also know that there will be a doubling of cancer cases until 2040. The infectious diseases, and we have this terrible coronavirus threatening the whole world at the moment and has been so for some time, and it took Theodore's life, which is so sad. We also have, in connection with infectious diseases, the other threat, and that's antibiotic resistance, where we have a real global threat to all of us. We talk about global heating, and that's one problem. But in my opinion, the antibiotic resistance is even worse and could be even worse, threatening our lives. Food quality, food waste is another challenge, and I will only touch upon this, and Professor Janine Swamberg will talk more about that. And from that point of view, it's interesting to know that for the food waste problem, about 30 to 40% of the food produced globally is wasted, which is of course a terrible situation. Here you can see the age standardized incidence of cancer around the world, all cancers, both sexes and all ages. And we see that there is a dominance in the Western world, in the developed world. 30% of the people in the Western world will die from cancer, and actually in China, 50% will have the same fate. So again, we need to remember that cancer is really an increasing threat to us. Some epidemiology facts here. It's important what we eat and the quality of food, as well as some social habits, tobacco smoking, for example. But we also have the environmental aspect with air pollution. And we can see also that the main, of course, terrible threat to us is age. So biology is one aspect that we cannot get rid of, but also the heredity. How does it look in the family? So these are, from the epidemiology point of view, aspects that we have to look upon. As Janis already said, we started clinical work in biophotonics quite early. Already in 1987, we were able to treat the first patient with photodynamic therapy. And at that time, there were not so many convenient lasers or practical lasers for the work. So actually, we started to bring over the patients to atomic physics division and utilize the lasers at that department, which were not, of course, devoted for clinical work, but could be also used for that. And that's the reason why our start was in a true interdisciplinary setting. And the work in Lund has all the time been with interdisciplinarity, where we have been working from the clinical side, taking the clinical challenges as a motivation, and on the technical side, the techniques were developed. So that's how we have been working, and this list really tells the same thing, where we have the medical collaborators in blue here, and the technical physics collaborators in red. And as you can see, there are some of the Greek collaborators also. I said that cancer is increasing, and one aspect for the prognosis of the patients is really early detection. Janis talked about fluorescence, and we have been using fluorescence, and I will go through some of our work there. We see from the table here that it is really important with early detection. From the breast cancer point of view, this is a cancer that will happen to 10% of the Western world females. Cure rate is very high if we discover the tumor early. On the other hand, if we discover or treat the tumor at a late stage, we see that the number of cure really goes down to a very low percentage. So fluorescence is one important aspect that we have been working with, and many other groups, of course, and it can be used for looking at the molecular composition in the tissue. And actually this, for the case of cancer, this happens, the molecular changes, before we can see the structural change, the morphological change. So that is one advantage with fluorescence, that it really shows sign from the transition point of view when tissue starts to develop into early cancer and, of course, further to invasive cancer. It's both the extracellular aspect as well as the intracellular aspect, and we can see there the excitation and the emission spectra for the different chromophores in the tissue. And this is exactly the same what we saw from Royal Hospital in London, where we also were dealing with fluorescence, but in the area of cardiovascular and vascular diseases with plaque formation, where fluorescence can be used for determining different kind of classes of the atherosclerosis. I show some pictures from joint work within European projects, and this is from one situation, as you can see, instrumentation from Lund Medical Laser Center brought to the National Technical University in Athens. This is one of the trials that we did together with Greek people, and you see happy faces, and you also can see to the right there Maria Curazzi working in the laboratory with a new drug. And what we were doing here was that we tried to see whether we could localize tumors deep lying, not only superficially, but also in the tissue, which has been one aspect that we have pursued later for the treatment of prostate cancer, for example. Another European project was with people from Louvain in Belgium, where we did fluorescence detection of superficial bladder cancer. If you look at the spectral information here, when we go through the bladder wall with small tumors sitting in the mucosa, we see how the spectral shape, the spectral characterization really changes, whether we look at normal tissue or in the tumor. And to the right there, you see some images where we use exactly the same technique, but only use a few wavelengths. And there you can see that even cancer that we could not see by the naked eye can be visualized with fluorescence. At the bottom there, you see also one interesting example that's from Munich and the work that is done there. And what you can see is that the large tumor, the one that you see as sort of a mushroom stitching out from the bladder wall, is easily recognizable in fluorescence also. But that is easy to see by the naked eye. But if you move upwards, you see an area which looks about normal, but still in fluorescence really shows the same sign of red fluorescence, which means that this is a good illustration on how invisible cancer can be made visible by fluorescence. This is from Lund, this tumor sitting on the back of a patient. And you also see the fluorescence image covering perfectly well the tumor. On the other side, you see one little area which is not covered with the fluorescence. And the reason for that is that this is actually not a tumor. This is a benign nevus. And this illustrates how specific fluorescence can be in the detection of early cancer or when we don't have any characteristic techniques for looking at the situation in detail. I mentioned that we started photodynamic therapy quite early, and this is the physics behind this technique. We have a sensitizing agent, a drug, a ring structure like I show there, a ring structure with new metal in the middle. So it's a pyrrole ring. We have the light of appropriate wavelengths. All these different sensitizers and tumor localizing drugs have their specific absorption peak, which we have to hit, of course. And then the third component that is needed is oxygen in the tissue. And you see when we excite these molecules and they go up to a higher energy level, falling down, they both show, of course, fluorescence, but they also have the excess energy, which is given over to the oxygen in the tissue, to the triplet state oxygen, which in turn is transformed into singlet state oxygen, which is very toxic for the tumor cells. So this is the basis for the therapy that we call photodynamic therapy. One of the first patients in Lund, you see the tumor sitting in the skin, and a few weeks later, you have absolutely no sign of the tumor, only some tissue that is healed and also without no scar, which is quite interesting and important aspect. Or this man who had cutaneous T-cell lymphoma located under his eye. He had gone through 9 cycles of cytotoxic drug delivery, but still he had these tumors sitting under the eye, and we treated with photodynamic therapy, and it healed quite nicely, as you can see. But there is a limitation, and that is the penetration depth. Tissue that or tumors that are lying deeper than the surface cannot be treated from with a perpendicularly shining light. There we need to be smart and reach the tumor inside, embedded in the tissue. And this is one solution, which is an early patent written by Professor Katarina Swamberg, the speaker after me, and how we started to develop the interstitial PDT. And one challenging indication for this is recurrent prostate cancer. Prostate cancer is, as we know, very, very common among men. It is equally much for men as breast cancer is for females, or even more, I would say. You have also the situation divided among different cancers, and you also can see that lung cancer has a high position among them. And we can apply this interstitial PDT by inserting fibers into the prostate and really have a possibility to treat the whole volume if we put the fibers in optimal positions, also sparing the organs at risk. The rectal wall, for example, the sphincters and the urethra that takes the urine out from the urinary bladder. This is an EPDT system which was constructed according to the lines of the patent, and it has treatment fibers, 18 treatment fibers, as well as the same fibers can not only deliver the light, but it can also monitor the sensitizer fluorescence and also the oxygen in the tissue. You remember there are all these three components that are important for the efficacy of PDT. And it can also be used, these optical measurements can be used for feedback dosimetry based on the light transmission. And this is a scene which shows how this is applied with the prostate being located below the urinary bladder with the fibers inserted. And as I said, each fiber delivers the light to the tumor, but at the same time also monitors these other aspects and can be utilized for interactive dosimetry. The clinical situation may look like this with an ultrasound. The prostate volume is characterized. The fibers are inserted through the matrix according to the program, and then the laser light can shine into with the ultrasound transducer in the rectal wall, taking care of the positions of the fibers, and all 18 fibers here are shining, sending in the light to the recurrent tumor. And we have, or the company has started clinical trials 2017, both in Toronto at Princess Margaret Hospital, as well as at the Medical College Hospital in London. And this trial is now going on, and hopefully can show the potential of this technique instead of hormone therapy, taking down the testosterone in men. And if we could show that this is a good alternative, then we hope for acceptance also wide in the society. Infectious diseases and antibiotic resistance is really another threat to mankind. And we see here the World Health Organization statistics, where infection diseases stands for 25% of the death in the world. The problem is, as I said, the resistance that is developed. We call them methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, for example, where you can see this world map where Scandinavia, northern countries have quite good situation. If you look at Europe, you see that Southern Europe really has a problem because there we have a lot of multi-resistant bacteria in the population. Already Alexander Fleming, who got the Nobel Prize for his discovery in 1945, foresaw this. He said in his speech when he got the Nobel Prize that it is not difficult for the microbes to develop resistance. And that is actually what has happened. The case of tuberculosis is shown to the left there. And what we can see is that the first and the second level of antibiotics are not efficient anymore, and we may be standing in the position of returning to a pre-antibiotic area. And why is this? Of course, one problem is that the antibiotics in many countries are available without any prescription. Like I show here from Guangzhou, a pharmacy where I could, in principle, buy any antibiotics without any prescription, not being a doctor even. To the left there, you see the development of new antibiotics. And you see that the boom was 1960, 1970, and not so many antibiotics are developed these days. So we have what we have, and we have to need to use them very carefully. We have developed in Lund with Professor Katarina Swamberg this technique, gas in scattering media spectroscopy. We call it gas mass. And that is a technique that look at the gases and the signals from the gas, in contrary to the fluorescence, for example, the signal is very sharp. It is 10,000 times more sharp than for example, the spectrum that we get from fluorescence. And when the laser light passes through a vesicle with gas, it gives us a signature, and we could use that for characterization, maybe to help guiding the treatment decisions in very common infectious diseases like sinusitis, for example, which affects the hollow organs in our facial skeleton. And the diagnostic methods are very few here. Clinical examination is more or less the only practical one. We could also, of course, use computer tomography and endoscopy, but that is not used in the general practice. We did a clinical trial where we used this technique. We used two lasers, one laser that hits the oxygen gas and one that hits that is for the water vapor. And why do we use water vapor? This is used for normalization of our oxygen signal, as water vapor concentration can be read off in the Ardenbach relation if we know the temperature. And that is interesting because oxygen, if oxygen is in the sinuses, there is a true sign that the channels are open, that the ventilation is open, which means that the infection have a possibility to clear itself without antibiotics. This clinical trial was composed in a way so we compared the computer tomography scan with our light-based technique. And you can see with the circles here that the CT results very, very much is comparable to our light-based gas mask results, which means that this technique could actually be, instead of delivering ionizing radiation to the patients, with the brain in the vicinity. And here we see the results of this clinical trial, where the sinuses that are sick in one way or the other are the outflyers. And if you look at the diagram where we have a lot of sinuses not fitting in the diagram's line, these are large sinuses. They have a large volume, but they have low oxygen, which tells us that there is a problem with the ventilation. This is further investigations that we have done, tested the stability of the technique and shown that we have quite good stability over a week with the patients and also over the day, which of course is the basis to have a baseline to follow and see differences from that and follow the situation for the patient. Another way of controlling the ventilation of the sinuses, I said that the ventilation is one good indication that the sinusitis can be healed by itself. If the channels are open, we can trust on that and not deliver antibiotics. And what we see here in this trial is that we let the patient have nitrogen flushed through the nose. And what we see is that the oxygen is pressed away and nitrogen comes instead of it. And then when we stop the nitrogen flushing, we see again that the oxygen is built up like in a capacitor. And we also tested this in sick patients where we saw there is no possibility with anticongestion to open up the sinus so well. So this is one example where it might be a possibility to reduce the antibiotic use. Another
Professor Swamberg, sorry to interrupt you. You have 2 or maybe 3 minutes of your time.
I have only 1 or 2 applications more. This is the same for the middle ear infection, where we have developed techniques both based on reflection spectroscopy, but also on the gas mask technique, where we now do experimental work in the lab to take this into the clinic, as well as in orthopedics actually. Fracture of the hip can lead to arthrosis, as we know, and we have followed the situation in vitro specimens and found that we could really see when arthrosis is developing and maybe help the orthopedician to make the decision for surgical processes, combined maybe with laser Doppler monitoring to follow the blood flow. My last application here shows how this can be used in preterm babies for lung saturation monitoring. And maybe instead of X-ray based investigations, use this for following the respiratory and saturation situation for this small vulnerable kids that are born, some of them 10% preterm, and to follow how the lung situation develops with different kind of treatments. And we have also recently taken this to an illumination inside the lungs, not only deliver the light and detect it from outside, but also to deliver the light from inside the lung or respiratory tree, and of course enhance the possibility to see signals, and maybe to take it over to adults, from small scale to large scale. And this is of course something very, very important in these days, where the respiratory could have this help of monitoring. So with this, I would really thank you for listening, but of course, thank Theodore for being such a great colleague in the Biophotonics Society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Swamberg, for this fascinating overview and the applications of biophotonics in real clinical settings. That, as you presented, they can make a real difference. So I'd like to now welcome to the floor Professor Swamberg, Sune Swamberg, Professor of Physics and founding director of the Lund Laser Center at Lund University. His research interests range from basic atomic physics to laser applications in the environment and biomedical sciences. He is also the initiator of the Lund Combustion Research Center and the Lund Medical Laser Center. He served on the ERC panels for 5 years, also as a chairperson. He also has received numerous national and international awards. He's a member of several academies and societies, and also served on the Nobel Committee for Physics for 10 years. He was lucky to meet also Theodore within Laser Lab Europe, but also within ERC. So Professor Swamberg, the floor is yours.
It's a great honor for me to be part of this memorial symposium for our friend Theo Papazoglou. Such a great man, great scientist, and great administrator, working really for all of us in a very important way, supporting science at the highest level, really something which really is to the benefit of all mankind. In this talk, I would like to share with you some experience from the area of applied laser spectroscopy, areas which were close to the heart of Theo. We heard in the previous talk, Professor Katarina Swamberg talk about lasers in medicine, a key topic for Theo. But other applications, very closely, are those to the environment, agriculture, and the cultural heritage areas. Being located in Lund, in the very north of Europe, we had the privilege to be able to join into the organization of Laser Lab Europe, where at the time we joined, there were only 3 large facilities in the laser areas. One of those were fourth in Iraklio, operated by Professor Kostas Fotakis together with Theo Papazoglou. And I had the corresponding role up at the Lund Laser Center. And we could join in here, and we had great times together trying to serve the European community. Now this has expanded tremendously, almost 40 laboratories. So from the small start, something quite important developed. Applied laser spectroscopy is a broad field. I illustrate part of that here in an overview of the group that Katarina Swamberg and I run jointly now after formal retirement from Lund. We still have some part-time job there, but we work also at South China Normal University in Guangzhou. And the topics covered by the group is from environment to ecology, agriculture, food safety to biomedicine. A very large area it looks at first sight, but as a matter of fact, for a physicist, this is all the same thing. Basically, we do the same thing, the same thinking, the same type of spectroscopy. What is different is the size of the optics, which might be very big when we talk about environmental monitoring over kilometer ranges, or it might be fiber optics when we deal with the human body, as we heard Katarina talk about. So I would like to cover these areas instead, which are quite related. And we could, in this picture, maybe see this connection, how really medicine and environment, for instance, are almost very similar in terms of the technology and the approaches. It's possible to monitor the gases in the sinus cavity by sending laser radiation in, scatter it off the brain, come out here, tune the laser to resonance with the oxygen molecules here, like Katarina has showed you. But of course, it's also possible to send laser radiation over kilometer ranges to a retroreflector coming back to the detector, and in that way monitor and map out the average concentrations of air pollutants like that. Centimeter scale, kilometer scale, but the rest is the same. Or take the case of fluorescence, we also heard quite a lot about. This is a lesion below the ear of a patient. We'll illuminate that with ultraviolet light and induce fluorescence. And by some processing of these fluorescence signals, we can show the pixels which actually fulfill the criterion of being cancer cells. So we see that in real time, like a television showing only cancer. The same thing can be done at much larger distance. In this case, we transmit the beam from a mobile system, laser radar system, working with fluorescence 60 meters away from the gate of the Lund Cathedral, 1,000 years old. We scan line by line over here, and by the fluorescence signature, we can, by multivariate analysis, show areas with different properties, not visible to the naked eye. Everything is sort of identical, as you can see here. We'll first start with discussing some problems regarding air pollution. Laser spectroscopy can do a lot of things in this field. I worked myself on this type of applications for maybe 40, 45 years now. This picture is from Houston in Texas. I got that from my friend Frank Tittel. Well, this is what it can look like on certain days. And this is not uncommon, of course, to see in China and not many places over in Europe. And it's of great interest to be able to know what is going on here, to map out in 3 dimensions the distribution of the pollutants. And that can be done. It can be done by laser radar techniques. This is a mobile system we constructed in Lund, one out of many generations. And we transmit out laser light from a rooftop mirror into the atmosphere. Light is backscattered, comes back, and is recorded as a function of time. That means function of range. This is just an illustration, happens to be at a plant in the Rosignano Solvay, south of Livorno in Italy. It has electrolytic cells filled with liquid mercury. And when the wind blows this direction, there is a halo of mercury atoms in the atmosphere. We scan vertically, and by doing that, we can encounter the atoms like this, centered around 250 meters away and up into the air, some 100 meters or so. It's like putting on glasses and see the world now only seeing mercury. And we do that by transmitting laser pulses on resonance with the absorption line of mercury, and then using a nearby wavelength where it's not absorbed. Similar things we do in China, where of course there is a lot of things to look at. You can see the system over here. Same type of construction. When it's not out in the field, we can dock it to the building and just step in here seamlessly into an advanced laboratory and use it like a normal lab, if you like. You can see that over here. And we have used this extensively in China. The idea is that whatever we can do in the laboratory, we can do anywhere in China. We can use the lab as an inner laboratory, but we can also use it as a remote sensing system transmitting the beam out. And this is one such example. It's from the Guizhou province, one of the poorer in China, where there's a lot of mining activities. And mining mercury means that you take cinnabar, that's mercury sulfide, you heat it, and when you heat it in air, liquid mercury comes out and sulfur dioxide together. And these are the tailings after containing a lot of mercury. When this is raining, of course, a lot of these pollutants merge into the water, into the agricultural fields. This doesn't look very good. And of course, pollution is a big problem at many places of the world. And you can see here how we map out that. We transmit the pulses out at the 2 wavelengths, the signal coming back out to 1 kilometer range, falls off strongly, illumination law, but it's absorbed more when we sit on the absorption line with our tunable laser, dividing the on resonance curves with the off resonance curves. We see a slope. If there wouldn't be any pollution, this ratio curve would be horizontal, but the slope tells us it's pollutant. And the inclination tells us something about the concentration, which is actually about 100 times more what we are used to at most places in Europe in this case. So this is one cities. That brings me to a very interesting area with a lot of Greek connections also, and that is the cultural heritage. We have used this technique in China to monitor one of the world's most famous places, the Terracotta Army Mausoleum in Xi'an. And we scanned the mausoleum over the emperor's tomb. He had a small army of 10,000 people watching him. But himself, he is down in a chamber down here. And the historical chronicles say that there are maybe 100 tons of liquid mercury in the tomb, the elixir of life in those days. If that's true, due to earthquakes and cracks and so on, there should then be a halo of mercury around this even now. And we did scan that over this mound and we saw the mercury. That was a quite fascinating project actually, together with the Terracotta Army Museum. These are our co-authors on this project. But of course, we can do things more close by here, especially using fluorescence, which we discussed a lot in terms of medical diagnostics. If we send the beam into water, you see the fluorescence, the algae in the water, the general pollution. You can normalize the signals on the Raman signal from water. It's again this trick to cancel out all those things we know nothing about, work with dimensionless quantities, cancel out the problems. And we can do the same thing, say, against a tree at a distance and see the fluorescent signature, like we can see the fluorescent signature of sensitizers in tumors and so on. It's just we do this, say, in 50 or 100 or 200 meters distance. This is such a campaign at Lund. I already gave some picture from that. That's our gate here, but we also got to Italy, many places over there. This is the Parma Cathedral and Baptistery. Fascinating things where you can see things not visible to the naked eye. And another famous place is, of course, the Colosseum in Rome, where we scanned these ancient 2,000-year-old walls and saw structures, you know, that you don't see with the naked eye. This is a famous place. There is one more, even more famous place, and that is the true human heritage of the Acropolis over there. And on a very nice occasion, I visited there again. Greece is really a favorite place for us, both Katarina and me. On the invitation, I, to my extreme astonishment, got an honorary doctorship. And that was arranged by a famous Greek scientist, Alexandros Papayannis, who actually in charge of all laser radar activities in the world, organizing these big things. When he was a young student, he came by train to Lund and first got in contact with LiDAR, which I did for 45 years now. So I will also help a bit in their new project on the Acropolis, where they will use fluorescence and so on to do these types of things there. So we just hope for the stupid pandemia to get away. Another way you can use the laser beams is if you focus it, you can focus and do LIBS, laser nuke breakdown spectroscopy, and actually make small spark. You can even clean a statue in 50 meters distance, as we demonstrate here. And of course, a speciality in Iraklio, for instance, is to clean artifacts of different kinds with spectroscopic guidance. A lot of papers. I once wrote a review on applied laser spectroscopy together with Kostas Fotakis, where he especially focused on these aspects. So that's a nice possibility. And of course, the spark tells us exactly how deep we are. So basically, this technique we have also used to try to guide cleaning of the atherosclerotic plaque. It's again by spectroscopy. You see where you are and when you should stop procedure, and then you fire with higher power to clean. So cleaning statues in 50 meters distance or cleaning arteries is for me basically the same project. You do exactly the same thing. So Let's go on and move a bit to agriculture. Katarina talked about all the food waste. Of course, we are very dependent on food production. And by laser-induced fluorescence, we can, in a distance, see the health of the vegetation by these signatures. In a distance, but also, of course, bring it inside the lab and do just the monitoring on site with everything under full control. Such a bus, 10 ton, is a bit awkward, of course, to move around. Already it's very practical at the same time. But we implemented this also on drones. Almost all the drones are made in China, actually in our neighboring city of Shenzhen, close to Hong Kong. And this can carry, you know, the 3 kilograms of our laser fluorosensor, which goes down. It has an imaging spectrometer. So at all ranges going down, we get the full spectrum and also range resolved in height. So we can map out the trees outside our labs here. We also did that for monitoring water. This is the Chujiang, the Pearl River, next to our laboratory. And you see the drone sending the laser beam down, inducing the fluorescence. We see the fingerprint of the oil, the algae, and so on. And that's, of course, infinitely cheaper than flying with helicopters and so on, which is normally done. So these are some examples of what you can do with fluorescence. A lot of focus in earlier talks has been on optics in scattering media. It's a very common thing. In medicine, we do this type of tricks, send the red light through the finger, and we see the halo of the light around. But of course, it's the same thing if you direct it through a pharmaceutical tablet. We had a €1 million project with AstraZeneca to do exactly this and find out about the constituents without dissolving the tablet. Or if you send the laser light through a slab of apple, you see the same physics. Or looking at the sun in our garden here, 10 meters from where I'm sitting, where you see the halo around the sun. The same physics, but on different scales. Same equations, different scientific communities doing this. And that's an interesting connection, actually. In LiDAR, which I discussed there, you fire laser pulses into kilometer range. Look to the light coming back here. But the gas mask technique, which Katarina told us about here, is the same thing. It's just that we launch the light in centimeters distance instead. Use the scattering coming back again and analyze that. In the atmosphere, we use the aerosol particles as reflectors and measure the gas in between the particles. In this case, most of the materials is solid or liquid, but there might be bubbles in there. So now we use the multiple scattering due to that, and now we analyze the gas inside the bubbles instead of outside the particles. Everything else the same. And that gave us very nice opportunities, as Katarina described, for instance, to send through foodstuffs and so on. As soon as we go through these gases places here, we see the sharp needle stitch, very sharp, compared to the solid state, very broad structures of the rest. Or this would be the case, say, of a sinus cavity of a patient, where we send it in, it rattles around, it comes out at this time instead of in transmission, and we see these imprints. The problem is, of course, we don't know the path length. So how do we get the concentration when you can't use the Beer-Lambert law? You need the distance. The trick is to normalize on water vapor because we know the concentration and we cancel out the problem. So this is true then in medicine, fruits, foodstuffs, wood, whatever you can think of, pharmaceutical tablets. And this is just an illustration of this with the tissue. You see, these are the hemoglobin absorption, the water melanin, very broad. And this is the optical window where light penetrates quite nicely. If you look at this region around 760, if I push the knob here, I tune in on this little area around 760 nanometer. There we find the Fraunhofer line, the A line of molecular oxygen in the atmosphere. And with high resolution, you see these hundreds of very sharp lines. Now we sit on one of these guys here and monitor the needle stitch of the oxygen inside anything which scatters and It's very sharp. You have to hit the 6th digit now. You know, normally in biophotonics, we hit the 1st or the 2nd digit in wavelength, but this is very sharp. And I won't talk about these other applications that Katarina discussed. Let me just say, if you take a little lump of sugar, like nanoporous materials like that, and send light through that, you might, although the distance is 7 millimeters, it looks like it's more than 5 meters. The photons almost never come out. And now if pollution gas comes in here, you can measure the concentration of pollution with the world's cheapest multipass cell without any advanced optics and so on. And that's illustrated here. Yeah, Katarina mentioned about the food stuff. And that's, of course, extremely important, especially in countries like China, third world, and so on. And these are just illustrations where we do exactly that. We send in the light in the headspace of a milk package. The light is rattling around, and we look at some light seeping out over here. Normalizing a water vapor, we know the temperature. We can see the concentration of oxygen without opening. Because remember, most food is not packed in air, it's packed in modified atmosphere. And it's all about keeping oxygen out. That's what packaging industry is about. And now we can use this technique online and the conveyor belt and look at every package. Something's wrong with that, we can kick it off the line. We can also look at fruits. Fruits are wasted a lot. And you can go look at the gas inside the fruits, but also look at the reflectance or fluorescence. And this is a particularly interesting case of avocado. I think we all know that it's hopeless to know if it's ripe because, you know, it looks the same all the time and you have a very bad surprise. But by this little gadget, we can now see whether we should really open it up because they are expensive fruits. Okay, that was about environment. We talked about agriculture, we talked about food. And we have a competitor for the food, and that is the insects, the agricultural pests that eat them. So agriculture pests are very important. That's a big disaster to fight. And we have to fight them for the other reasons. They are devastating vectors for infections like malaria. People might ask, why is progress so slow in Africa? The answer by specialists is a very simple one. The answer is malaria. 500,000 people die every year, mostly children actually. And you know, so many people are affected by that. Can we keep track of these guys here? Loaded with blood. Perfect spectral signature, by the way, from biophotonics to do that. Or the pollinators. You know, a third of the food we eat, we need the pollinators. It would be a very meager diet if we don't have this. And we do our best to kill them all with insecticides. So now the idea is if we could see even the particles in the air by laser radar techniques and doing their pollution monitoring, it would be infinitely easier to look at the big particles called insects. And that works wonderful, actually. So here is the Swedish system. We bounce the beam, it passes over the surface of a river, you see here, 0.5 meter above. And when every one of these guys fly into the beam, the coffee drinking students sitting in the bus will see it on the computer screen. So we can do sociology here about what these guys are doing. And the general idea would be something along these lines. You fire the laser, you hit it over there, fluorescence comes back, we sort it up into different channels, and we get the echos in fluorescence at 80 meters distance in different colors. So we have a spectral fingerprint. Who is there and what are they doing? You can do this even simpler. Former PhD student and we started to do this instead with CW lasers, send out cheap CW lasers, 2 watts or so by a telescope, observing that at a slant angle by static LiDAR, just with 0.5 meters distance, and image the line sharp at all distances. It's called the Scheimpflug geometrical conditions being met there. And by doing that, you can, for 10,000 euro, build up systems like that and do fantastic monitor, like we do here over a Chinese rice field by a system along these lines. Different type of lasers, you can do spectroscopy by doing that. Differential reflectance spectroscopy, you can look for depolarization and see if the insects are hairy or not. Scattering media, you know, a raindrop would not depolarize light according to the scattering theory and so on. And if you look at your computer screen here, you would see like on a film how all these blobs are coming up, coming and going, coming and going. This is close range. This is a stop half a kilometer away here. And we see that all the time. And we can even expand these and read out very quickly. And what do we see then? Then we see the wing beat frequencies. So each echo can be characterized by its wing beats. And with statistics over that, we can see what are the wing beats in the evening and in the morning. Quite different. Mosquitoes or larger things. And we can see the sociology here over a full day. The light you see here, this is the ambient skylight. That's the background light. So you see, this is early morning. This is the evening in China in this time. And interestingly, we can see the insects that start to fly at sunrise. And a lot of them come in the evening. We know all that by fighting mosquitoes in the evening and so on. What is interesting is these blue echos here. These are the big ones. These are the bats. And you can see they start a little earlier in the morning and they start a bit later in the evening. Not when they have most food there, because then they are afraid of the hawks who would take them. So we notice this strange sociology, this delay by 15 minutes on this by these techniques. I'm coming to the end here, and the good news about applied laser spectroscopy, the type of applied laser spectroscopy that Theo liked so much, is that it can also be easily transferred to low-income places. And from Lund, together with many good forces, we did project for almost 20 years now, taking in groups from Africa and so on, building simple fluorescensor here. Katarina did fluorescence diagnostics in Senegal almost 15, 20 years ago with these type of things here. And we bring in these telescopes, for instance, to strange places like Mali and so on. We do setups for malaria monitoring, multispectral imaging like that. And this is, of course, something which is very good, that our research in the West, talking about ERC, all the advanced stuff we are doing here, it can also really be realistically transferred to the third world. Like malaria fighting, as I said. This is just one example here, how you can take the cheap LEDs, 13 of them here, and you ignite one after the other, make a black and white image on that on a very cheap sensor. And we go through here and do spectroscopy, not on the detection side. That's expensive. We do spectroscopy on the illumination side, which is for free. We image all these things in transmission, in backscattering, and in dark field. We have 39 images, multivariate analysis. Nobody can hide then under this scrutiny. And you can show the pixels where you have the malaria parasites and do quick analysis. And people do this in different groups in Africa, do smart things about that. And that's a very nice aspect, I think, which we can use our science to share with the ones who have very little. And of course, the ERC, with all these clever people working there, under the fantastic guidance of Theo and all the colleagues there, that's really making a big impact for European science. But as I always emphasize in China, it's not a question of improving things only in China. It's the world, and the ERC and European science, it's for the benefit of mankind. And this is exactly what it's all about, to make this blue planet the place that Theo Papazoglou really loved. He loved life with his wonderful family and with all the colleagues. This is the blue planet. for the legacy of Theo. Let's take care of this. Let's promote, let science spread the message of friendship all over the world. Thank you, Theo, for great science, for leadership and friendship above all. And thanks to all collaborators, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you for Professor Swamberg for this wonderful talk. We will move on now to Professor Zakarakis from the Technical University of Munich. Professor Zakarakis got his electrical engineering degree at the Aristotle University in Thessaloniki, and then he moved to University of Pennsylvania for a master and a PhD thesis in bioengineering. And then he served as an assistant professor at Harvard before he joined the chair of biological imaging at the Technical University of Munich, also as a director of the Institute for Biological and Medical Imaging. He has numerous awards in Germany and internationally, and he has been a pioneer of biooptics and biophotonics for many years. It's really an honor to have you here, Vasily.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I think you can hear me now. I'm using a different microphone. Can you hear me? Yes. So, Maria, you need to allow me to share screen on. I've logged into EYES with a VAS, not with my name, but with a VAS.
Okay, just a moment, please. VAS. You must be a co-host now.
Let me see if I can share the screen. Yes, okay. So it is a great honor for me to be a speaker in this event and to tell you a little bit of our common interests with Theodoris and how we sort of like started 20 years ago on this interacting on biooptics and how it evolved. What you see here in the background is the Translatum building, is a building on translational engineering research. And in the end of my talk, I will tell you a little bit also about science policy that we're trying to do in Munich, but also propagate a little bit more globally. So, as I mentioned, 20 years ago, we were fascinated by the opportunities that the fact that light penetrates through tissue could give, both in terms of its basic interactions with tissue, but also in its ability to use it for medical applications. Back then, I was developing tomographic methods for breast cancer imaging. I was building systems that they would go into a magnet so that we could perform optical tomography and magnetic resonance imaging simultaneously. And we were already showing that there was optical contrast that could complement that of MRI. It was the early days of optical measurements, and that stimulated a lot of developments that are, some of them I will discuss in the talk today. Now, Theodoris took note of these developments, and he had very similar interests, as Yannis mentioned, and I'm amazed he was working on these very interesting but also important directions. He had the random lasing that, you know, even 12 years later became sort of like big news on the ability of tissues to indeed exhibit lasing properties. He was working on artificial neural networks for discriminating pathologic from normal tissues, which essentially evolved now into this artificial intelligence, which is a very similar type of task with just advanced artificial neural network work. He was also working, as Yannis mentioned, on understanding tissue properties and fluorescence and so on. So there's a lot of commonalities. So Theodoris invited me in Crete. And really, this is, I had never been in Crete before. And this started a love affair with me and Crete, generating many friends, a lot of beautiful collaborations, and of course, admiring the island itself from its beauties, you know, the sea, climbing Psiloritis mountain with snow, all of this diversity. So soon enough, I decided to do a sabbatical there. This was the time, it was an amazing time. It was a powerhouse. Kostas Fotakis was in charge of the ISL. Theodore had amassed a lot of amazing people around him in biooptics. This was my desk that you can see there where I did my sabbatical, and overall I had a great time. And as Jorge mentioned, he had the capacity to organize these amazing events and invite who's who in biooptics. That is this conference. It was a beautiful occasion. We had it. I mean, this is one of the huge perks of Crete in addition to the science, of course. And really, so many important people we see here: Stefan and Katarina Swamberg, Kupedu, Kostas Fotakis there with Arjun Yod, Andreas Hilser with Simon Aritz. This was this night that it will be in the minds of everyone in the memories. It was the sort of the conference dinner. And I found an interesting photograph here. You see us doing this traditional, let's say, Greek dance. I am here, and it's funny, interesting, because the photo you see Theodore here with Kostas Fotakis, and from all of these people participating in the dance, they all came to Boston and started the new chapter of biooptical measurements. Jorge joined, and Yanis, and it started this new Boston chapter. This is George Themelis, Adonis Papadakis, and Janine Zakarakis. You see Yanis with a little bit darker hair. Well, we all changed. That's 15 years ago or so in Boston. That's some other photographs from the lab now when he joined in Boston as well. Back then, we were working on building tomographic machines to now get fluorescence out of tissue. So we were supposed to use contrast agents in order to read molecular information from tissue, not just the intrinsic contrast that biooptics gives. And we were already showing that we could localize, for example, molecular activity into the brains of mice here, or to see inflammatory signals with these fluorescent agents that we were injecting these mice from the lung. And this was the first time we could see molecular activity through entire bodies, because if you only take photographs, fluorescence photographs from animals, obviously you only see the surface. But with these technologies, we could go deep inside and visualize molecular activity. So when Yanis joined, and continuing the legacy from Crete and what Theodore had put together, he started working on a new tomographic system we had that worked like this. It's almost a tomosynthesis device. Light comes from one side. Maybe here you can see laser comes from this side. And then we were reading the different signals coming through the tissue with a camera. And that was establishing projectors. So we're doing tomography, not just looking at the images, but applying mathematics. And Jorge was also very fundamental in developing these techniques. And I gave Yanis a project to see if he could see fluorescent proteins, because we had done this with fluorescent agents, but fluorescent proteins are obviously much more specific, and they can see genetic activity as well. And this is work that Yanis did, a lot of long hours on persisting on experiments that they were difficult because of the low SNR. Nevertheless, Yanis was demonstrating here how he could see through a mouse a tumor. You see, this is a cross-section now with an X-ray CT. You see the tumor growing and how he could detect the signal. And certainly he demonstrated this, but he also demonstrated something very interesting, that even today, I see a lot of scientists not really understanding this part. So you have a mouse or a tissue and it has fluorescence in it. And if you illuminate in a photographic mode, like essentially you illuminate this with laser light and then you take a photograph through a filter, you see the fluorescence, but the fluorescence is, even if you see a little bit of activity here, the fluorescence essentially is compromised because also the skin has a lot of fluorochromes and you lose the contrast. And a lot of people say, oh, there's a lot of background fluorescence in the visible. Let's move to the near infrared and even further to the short wavelength, which is beneficial. But if you just transilluminate, then you can nicely see the volumetric fluorescence from within the tissue, and you avoid all of this surface fluorescence that you see here. And this part, I think even in modern papers, papers we read these days, it is not very well understood because everybody thinks of this photographic mode and not the transillumination mode that changes the statistics and the SNR that we can get from fluorescence in tissues. Now, from that point, we developed a lot of different technologies in the lab, and we focused a lot on optoacoustic tomography, but we continued working with these fluorescence molecular imaging methods and tomography. We also looked at other parts of the radiation, near field, so essentially radio electromagnetic radiation, but also high energy beams and so on. And I will give you a few examples on how we evolved and where we are now. So we were developing these tomographic methods and we coupled them to CT so that we could have very accurate co-registration of the anatomical signals together with these molecular signals we were reading because of the fluorescence tomography. This is a technology that was commercialized by Perkin-Elmer. We had a startup and then we exited to Perkin-Elmer. And it's a very useful technology. We're still developing now systems, and there have been systems placed all around the world. We also started this very interesting story. Since we had fluorochromes now that they could target cancer very specifically, we started injecting them into patients in order to help doctors do better surgery or endoscopy. And the observation here is clear. If you think about it, we have all of this technology in hospitals, but surgeons, when they do surgery, they still use their eyes to find when tumor might be here. And it's very difficult to see where the tumor is because the human eye is not a particularly good detector in detecting cancer in surrounding tissue. There's no particular contrast. So with the fluorescence technique, you see all of this green spot, we could show much better where cancer is compared to the surgeon's vision. This became a very success story. It started, back then in 2000s with these fluorescent agents. At the end of the day, we also had another startup. This technology has now been exited to Bracco in Italy, and they are propagating it now with phase 3 clinical trials, because obviously it makes sense that if you want to do surgery or endoscopy, if you have a way to be more specific, you wouldn't be doing it just with your eyes, the same way that they were doing it 3,000 years ago. And we're also managed to run our own clinical trials in Munich. We are funded by DFG, the German research agency, in order to do this type of imaging in breast cancer. And as I mentioned, Bracco now is running phase 3. But also, this is extremely powerful. We have gotten from Europe funding to do a phase 2 clinical trials on esophageal cancer. But this is not for therapeutics. This is not for surgery. This is for early detection. We had already preliminary data that we show that we can see up to 40% better than the endoscopist vision. So again, instead of the endoscopist going there with a simple endoscope and looking their eyes to detect disease, we have this fluorescent signal. This is done with a targeted agent. In this case, is labeled bevacizumab. And if we manage really to achieve about 25% better cancer improvement, these are the numbers. We can start saving a lot of lives and a lot of healthcare costs. And there is an interesting concept behind this that is not very well funded and it's not very well explored. It is that of early detection. We have this paradigm of biologists discovering pathways and developing drugs. This is well established. But we know from dermatology, but also other diseases, that if we find cancer or other disease earlier, we can treat it. In esophageal cancer, for example, if you see a cancer that is small enough, you can just take it there endoscopically, and that's a curative procedure. If it infiltrates and becomes metastatic, you have about a very adverse prognosis, and the healthcare cost, even with this adverse prognosis, is more than 100,000 euro per person. So it is really of benefit to detect disease early, and early detection has not received the attention that it should as part of improving healthcare and reducing costs. And we also focused on optoacoustics because we have demonstrated the ability to detect molecular activity, and certainly from superficial tissues like endoscopy and surgery. But we wanted to use light to go deeper, and to go deeper with high resolution. And here with 2 ERC advanced and overall a number of, we have about 9 ERCs just in my institute, but also from the Ministry of Research in Germany and the Research Foundation in Germany. They have funded us to develop a lot of different technologies and promote this optoacoustic technology. First of all, optoacoustic is a way of doing optical imaging, but instead of using cameras to detect it, we're using ultrasound detectors. The light is pulsed light. It generates ultrasound signals inside the tissue, which we detect with ultrasound detectors. What is the benefit? This is the typical optical image. It's very diffusive, as Jorge also showed, because of photon scattering. Once we switch to optoacoustics, photon scattering goes away. We solve that fundamental limitation that light had for 350 years, that it could not penetrate deeper with high resolution because of scatter. Scatter goes away with optoacoustics. What you see here is cross sections through a mouse. This is the brain, the head, and further down, these are the kidneys, here the liver. We have high resolution optical imaging for the first time that goes much deeper than the optical microscope, much deeper than 1 millimeter. So this is, in a way, a new way of doing optical imaging that only has been evolving in the past 15 years or so. And we had a lot of interest to apply it clinically. So by now, we have built systems and we are applying it in clinical studies. We are seeing, for example, how we can see metabolism in the body, label-free, without any labels, without using ionizing radiation, in a portable manner. Others have taken our technology and they show how they can see inflammation in the gut, or how they can characterize muscle dystrophy. We also can produce these very beautiful images. This is angiogenesis in cancer. This is the human skin in ways that you have not seen it before. This is a cross-section through the human skin. You see here the dermal vasculature, the epidermal capillary loops. This is a technology that really takes light and makes it high resolution. So it gives us so much new opportunity to observe and characterize processes that only light can. For example, oxygenation in the human tissue, visualize inflammation without labels, and a lot of other parameters. This is a story that has taken, as I mentioned, more than a decade, and the technology has been evolving continuously. We have building new lasers, new detectors, new algorithms. The number of channels that we're having improves. We were also awarded here the German Innovation Award in 2014. And through our company, spin-off company, Ithera Medical, we have now developed systems like this that they have been placed all around the world. And really our interest is to see how we can benefit the patient and the health by taking these technologies and moving towards early detection. This is a technology that generally is receiving now significant interest, also from politicians, from the media. You see here our most recent clinical device, a handheld device. It combines optoacoustic together with ultrasound, and we are applying it to a lot of different applications. I showed you already some. We also have applications in breast cancer, in thyroid cancer, in obesity, and understanding responses of diabetic patients to exercise and nutrition. There is a lot of different applications. In parallel, we are not doing only instrumentation and algorithms and theory. We are still working with contrast agents, and we have a full-blown program. I'm not going to go into detail, obviously, here, where we are developing new ways of visualizing biology by using classical optoacoustic agents, by engineering bacteria. The bacteria are a very interesting modality because you can engineer them to distribute in the body, localize where you want, and they are very happy in tumors. And there you can use them therapeutically, but also you can use them as sensors to understand how cancers work. And we can see here inflammation in the cancer using bacteria as agents. And there's this beautiful technology of switchable chromoproteins This is what enabled the high resolution, the super resolution imaging and the Nobel Prizes in 2014. But we can also use it to significantly improve the SNR in optoacoustics and go down to single cell detection throughout bodies. This is the goal, at least. So there's a lot of interesting activity when we go to engineer contrast, and these bioengineering approaches are really having a lot of potential. And we're also working with new microscopy methods. This is a technology we introduced just last year that can visualize carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, label-free, without any labels, by switching optoacoustic microscopy to the mid-IR. And there is mid-IR spectroscopy, there is Raman imaging that are trying to do this, but optoacoustics is very powerful because it solves a lot of the problem of the optical methods, such as mid-IR spectroscopy, and it's up to 3 orders of magnitude more sensitive than Raman. So we are developing, of course, we're putting a lot of attention to this MIROM, this mid-IR optoacoustic microscopy, as a way to detect biochemistry in tissues, label-free. And we believe that it will do everything that Raman could do, but with much higher sensitivity. So it will really have a saying into this label-free detection in microscopy, but also in clinical applications. And finally, this is a program that we are developing. It's very exciting. It's the way now to detect ultrasound with light without using ultrasound elements, because when you switch to optical technologies, to photonic technologies, you can do a significantly better detection of sound in many respects compared to the PCT, to the piezoelectric elements. We're working on different methods, interferometric and so on. And we hope to, at the end, have all optical systems that do optoacoustics, because you can also miniaturize them. And one of these developments came also last year, where we engineered the world's smallest ultrasound detector. This is what is a small ultrasound detector with conventional means, maybe 20 by 20 microns. This is already one of the smallest detectors you can have. Our detector is 1/2 by 1/2 micron. So it is so small, it's based on photonic technologies, on photonic chips with interferometric detection. And the interesting thing here is that this is so much smaller than the ultrasound wavelength that we can do super resolution ultrasound just by means of the very small physical size of our detector. All of these technologies now are geared towards this concept we're having for microscopy and biological discovery, of having microscopes that they are not doing just 1 or 2 things, but they use this optoacoustic ability together with the optical ability to do what optics traditionally do, with all of the ability to detect label-free biology using these MIROM techniques. The other advantage of optoacoustics is scale. Optoacoustics is not limited to the first millimeter, it can penetrate much deeper, so we can start seeing under our microscope much deeper and much bigger specimen than what it is available today. So essentially, we are talking about microscopes that advance both the mode, the contrast, and the scale. These are multimodal scopes that they combine optical, 2-photon, for example, conventional optoacoustics, second harmonic, third harmonic generation optical microscopy, with all of this wealth and strength of optoacoustics, both in terms of detecting molecules label-free, but also in terms of going much deeper than microscopy. Actually, this is work that, again, has been developed together with Crete, following that legacy that Theodore left. This was work that started with Dr. Zakarakis, who's back now at Forth, and has recently led to a nice collaboration with Yanis on this dynamic project to develop one of these hybrid scopes in order to do ophthalmic measurements and advanced ophthalmology. Finally, we're working on this interface of technology and medicine and science. And what we are seeing continuously, especially as I keep interacting massively with medical doctors, but also with biologists, what becomes evident for an engineer like me is that there is a huge gap. And it's a huge gap in the medical sciences that I think we need to address. So in Munich, we have started a crusade to say the following. If you look at the natural sciences and you try to understand what's physics and what's engineering, physics is a culture of discovery and knowledge. The physicist will discover the world, they will try to understand the basic laws and rules. But if you want to bring a solution, if you want to build a product, you have engineers. A traditional engineer, an electrical engineer, a mechanical engineer does not work on a different knowledge basis than a physicist. It's all physics, but it is a different culture. It's a culture of problem solving. That is the difference between an engineer and a physics person. What do we have in medicine today? In medicine, we still have this, in my mind, myth that the biologist will both discover and bring solutions. It did not happen in physics, and for many, physics is simpler than biology, because biology is probably much more complex. So how is it possible that we will have a culture of discovery and knowledge like biology do also the work of the engineers in order to solve problems in medicine? In fact, I think this is really the reason why we're discussing today that we have a very slow translation. Slow translation does not mean that biologists do not do their job. It means that not one discipline can do everything. And what we're missing here, it's again a culture of problem solving, people that define their culture and their profession, not in terms of discovery and building new knowledge, but in terms of defining problems and then amassing all of the information, building new tools where needed in order to accelerate how this knowledge becomes solutions. And with these ideas here, we are trying to sensitize Munich, Bavaria, but also Germany. We have been successful because these concepts are now resonating. We have already developed 3 centers, which I'm fortunate to serve as a director on the advisory board of all of them. They are based on these ideas. There's the Helmholtz Pioneering Campus that brings together young scientists to work with biology and engineering. And again, the idea here is not just co-localized by biology and engineering, just to have offices next to each other. The idea is to put engineering the driving seat of getting the discovery of the biologist to medicine. So it's not just a throwing together disciplines, but it's a pipeline. The same goes in this new center, the Bioengineering and Digital Health Center that we developed, and the Translatum, which we're already in. This was the first building that was developed. This is on translational oncology. This is on translational metabolism. And this is really on new technology, solidifying more the technological part. With that, I would like to finish my talk. It is a great loss that we don't have Theodoris around us. He was a good friend, a great friend, a person that really started the legacy that came to Boston with a lot of the people also present now today in the meeting. We had discussions that he would come and visit Munich and we would meet again, and then COVID happened. It's very sad. It's a big loss, as I mentioned, and he will always be in our memories and our heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vasily, for this amazing work and presentation, and also the prospect of bridging different disciplines to try and bring solutions to medicine, you know, using knowledge that has been developed over decades to actually bring solutions, real solutions to the clinics and medicine. Now we go to the discussion and questions session. You can post your questions on the chat, and we will put them on to the speakers. But as the process goes on, I can maybe start, you know, phrasing a couple of questions. The first to Vasilis, who's just finished. I asked you also a couple of months ago during the EMIM about this new ultrasound detector. So I asked the same question again, like almost a year after, not a year, but several months. So when are we going to have the actual sensor so that it can be used in systems? I saw the published patent. It was really nice. And
So first of all, these detectors, they are solid, and they are, you know, once you manage to put them on chips, then they become very robust as well. The problem here is that putting them on chips needs infrastructure that very few places around the world have. So we have been collaborating with European centers. Usually what they do is that every 6 months they have requests, and you can ask them for your wishes, and they make this, but it's a very slow process. I can tell you, however, this. There's another paper coming soon out in Nature Photonics from another group. They just came to our center, we gave them the detector, and they measured their signals, and it just worked. So it's very robust. The problem is, it is not very scalable now, because in a lab, we cannot have this infrastructure. But once we can go to big companies, so for example, if you wanted a sensor like this, in the next 6 months, we can order a batch from one of these manufacturers of photonic technologies. We can send you one. It's very inexpensive.
We would love to have, even before the 6 months, but yeah, thank you. I have another question for Katarina. So you showed that you know, cancer is a big problem, and the cases of cancer increased dramatically over the years, and they would increase dramatically over the next decades. This is a question that I always have. Is this a let me put it this way: how much is this related to modern lifestyle and you know, the conditions that we have created to planet, and how much is related to better diagnosis and better methods to actually find and you know, detect tumors?
Of course, the last thing that you say is evident, that we can discover more cancers. That's true with more sophisticated diagnostic techniques. But I also think that we have a real contribution from environmental aspects. For example, we can easily see that breast cancer, for example, even prostate cancer, has higher incidence numbers in urban areas than in rural areas. We can see, for example, that breast cancer in regions where they have more natural life with early birth to the first child, longer period of breastfeeding, has lower incidence. So there are factors that really we could identify. Food is another very important aspect, and I showed numbers of 30% that could be, from an epidemiological point of view, explain how it interacts with our body. So I am quite sure that the environmental factors, pollution, all these things really has an influence on our health. That's for true.
Thank you. So there are quantifiable factors relating to modern lifestyle also, but yeah, and then the better methods will help identifying earlier these cancer occurrences.
So the earlier we can discover, the better the prognosis. I mean, the numbers are really high if there is an early detection.
Okay, thank you. I don't see something in the chat, but if there is a question from the audience live, maybe they can request to maybe raise the hand and have the question. So there is a question from Ionas. Thank you very much. It's addressed to me and to Jorge. The question is, Ionas wrote, I found it interesting to hear that biophotonics employed artificial neural networks as statistical learning models so early in the 2000s. Was this computationally challenging so early before high-speed computation power was developed? Jorge, do you want to say something, or I can comment on the study that we did then?
Sure, I can say at least a little bit from our side. I can tell you that for the tomographic part, the computers were extremely slow and until GPUs came about. So now you can do probably the same thing with a normal computer without using GPUs. But then it was GPUs, and before GPUs, we basically couldn't. I remember once we had to the computer running for 2 weeks to run a simulation I can run now probably in like tenths of a second. All right, in our house, and we lost all the data because I did something stupid, classical things like that. So yes, that was very challenging actually. And I think especially with regards to optical tomography, that was the main difference between groups that use very simple approaches like what we did, analytical solutions, versus groups that use complex, like for example, finite element methods for solving problems. At the beginning, there was a big difference. Then later on, it became easier. That's from my side.
So if I may add to that the study that we did with Theodore at that time, it was based on very simple measurements. So that was in the benefit of us. So there were no, big images, big data, big things to, to compute. So this helped really a lot to actually try to run this. At that time, if this was attempted to be applied in images, it wouldn't go as well as it did. I hope that this answered your question, or yeah, okay. All right. Okay, so this was a comment, not a question. If there are no further questions, I'd like to thank all the speakers of this scientific part of the workshop for their great presentations, fascinating results, and also for their contribution to the field. And I will pass on the floor to Professor Zakarakis for the final remarks and closing of the workshop. Nektaria.
Thank you, Yanni. So I would like to once more thank you all for being here today. I want to especially thank all our speakers for their amazing interventions and presentations, as well as all those who contributed to make this event today a reality. Theo's memory will live through his family, his friends, and all his colleagues who knew and worked with him. His impact has been profound on multiple levels and will resonate, I'm sure, for the years to come. I would also like to already extend an invitation to the symposium we plan to organize in the memory of Theo as soon as the pandemic subsides and all his friends are able to physically meet again. Until then, take care and stay safe. Thank you all again and have a nice weekend.